Okami is a masterpiece, one of the rare gems where each separate part, the art, the story, the music, the gameplay, it all combines perfectly to realize a singular vision with style that hasn't been matched since its 2006 release. The game creates a huge, lively world inspired by Japanese mythology, with a visual style inspired by traditional Japanese ukiyo-e paintings that manages to be cartoony and fun when it wants to be, and downright beautiful the rest of the time. The characters are all goofy and endearing in their own way, and watching the dim, lifeless environments you first encounter explode back to their verdant selves makes you personally care about the world. The music in the game is perfectly complementary to the setting and uses rich textures, open harmonies, and evocative melodies that pull you right into the game's Inkbrush world. It's a big game with a big soundtrack, and there are all kinds of tunes running from goofy to action-packed to creepy, but a big part of the game's musical identity is how it draws you into its beautiful, dreamlike environments, and I want to dissect 3 pieces that I think exemplify the mystical, otherworldly quality that sets the tone for the world as you explore it. First, cursed Shinshu plains, then the Lake Harami theme, and finally, enter Waka. So, without further ado, let's brush up on the music of Okami. First off, for a game set in mythological ancient Japan like this, full of characters from Japanese folklore and Shinto gods, the first job the music has to fulfill is to create an appropriately traditional Japanese aesthetic. But in an interview, lead composer for the game Masami Ueda said that they found sticking to traditional Japanese styles and instruments quite limiting. Early on, I hesitated to use even a violin, but we gradually increased the scope of the project. Harp and piano, then analog synth. It was easier not being bound by Japanese instruments. That said, we used Japanese instruments that play melodies as much as we could, and for percussion, we used Japanese percussion instruments. In each of the examples we're going to look at today, the majority of instruments used are nothing close to what you'd hear in gagaku, or ancient Japanese court music. Furthermore, the compositional style is quite Western in terms of harmony, melody, and form. In fact, only a handful of musical cues throughout the game are written in true gagaku style, such as when meeting the celestial brush gods, where the elegant, impressive style that's so strange to modern ears fits perfectly for these ethereal encounters. And yet, the rest of the soundtrack does achieve an appropriate sound for the setting through smart use of a few key compositional elements. As Ueda said in the same interview, "The chord progression is Western style, and I realized that by paying attention to melody, tone, and the way I used grace notes, I could make something that wasn't quite Japanese style, but sounded like it." We can quickly hear just what Mr. Ueda means by checking out the music that plays in the cursed Shinshu field toward the beginning of the game. The arrangement as a whole relies heavily on harp, strings, and even oboe, but the initial melody is played by a shinobue, a traditional Japanese flute made from bamboo, and uses grace notes in a way that's totally idiomatic to how that instrument is typically played. Watch out especially for these minor third trill grace notes going into these E notes. Notice too how this phrase of the melody centers around one note, the 5th of the key, E, and uses movement that fits within an A minor pentatonic scale. This pentatonic scale restriction gets broken in the very next phrase, but even just starting the piece with this stereotype of Eastern music sets the tone in a way that carries through the rest of the piece. Okay, so we can see how musically representing this ancient culture could contribute to an otherworldly sound, but surely that's not all it takes. And what about that mystical quality? Well, first, let's talk about harmony. We see the string pads that underscore the flute melody here ditching simple triads in favor of sus chord type voicings, where a typical chord is built from third intervals up from its root note, containing the root, third, and fifth. The chords in Cursed Shinshu Field's theme are built almost entirely with second and fourth intervals, and trade out the thirds of chords for the fourths and seconds of the chords. They also aren't afraid to use upper extensions on chords in unconventional ways. The A sus4 chord that opens up the piece holds its voicing as the bass moves down from an A to a G, combining to create a G chord with the 5th, the 6th, the 9th, and no third. Not a sound you hear every day, but a very cool one nonetheless. The F chord that follows is voiced with the major 7th and the root right next to each other for that nice half-step crunch, and then the sharp 4th on top, which resolves up to the 5th of the chord. Once again, no 3rd present. The phrase closes off with an E7 sus4 using mostly a stack of 4ths to build the voicing. This descending pattern from the 1 chord to the 5 chord is very common in a minor key, but it is not very common at all to voice every single chord in this progression as some version of a sus chord. It gives the music a totally different color than what we're used to. The following phrase sets up a modulation to the key of D minor with a flat 6 to flat 7 to 1 move, although again the chords are voiced with almost all 4th and 2nd intervals for a unique harmonic color. The section ends off with a D sus2 chord, but in the very last bar the 2nd resolves up to the minor 3rd, giving us a normal triad for the first time in the tune. You don't even really realize there's harmonic tension being built up by these sus chords until that D minor triad comes along and releases it all. These sus chords are a critical part of the sound of the world here. They're open, kind of mysterious, slightly cold sounding, but absolutely gorgeous played by those strings. The same harmonic approach is used in my personal favorite track of this video, the Lake Harami theme, and a key factor in the sound of the harmony in both of these pieces is the fact that these sus chord voicings are used over what would be minor chords. Sus chords, especially extended sus chords that last bars upon bars, are usually hiding a major 3rd, and it's not unusual to hear major 3rds used as passing notes in melodies over top of these kinds of sus chords. Using a sus chord voicing of a minor chord instead has its own distinct identity, and it's a really cool sound that the Okami soundtrack makes frequent use of. For example, the Lake Harami theme is clearly in the key of A minor, with the entire A minor scale spelled out by the melody in the first 2 bars, but the harmony stays on an A7 sus chord for almost the entire section. It mostly uses a G over A sound, a colorful type of sus chord where a G major triad is used over an A bass note to give us the flat 7, the 2nd, and the 4th of the tonic A chord. But just like in Shinshu Field, we resolve to a typical A minor triad in the last 2 bars of the phrase to release the harmonic inconclusiveness of that sus chord sound. Staying in one harmonic place for a whole section like this, especially when that harmonic place is so rich and colorful, is more than suitable for the calm, still waters and beautiful views of Lake Harami. Now let's talk about the musical texture on display here. The piece is driven primarily by the harp, which doubles the melody with the pizzicato strings and then adds an accompanying 8th note line that sort of arpeggiates the harmony, but not in a patternistic way. It would be easy to see this type of harp accompaniment working out as a 1-5-1-3 figure or some variation of that repeats itself as the tune moves through a chord progression. As we've established, there really isn't a chord progression so much as just a chord, and the harp expresses that harmony in a more melodic approach to the accompaniment. The rhythm of the line isn't a consistent pattern. Some notes anticipate beats, some hang in the air for a full beat or beat and a half, and while there is an identifiable 2-bar pattern that kind of repeats itself, there are a bunch of variations of rhythm and note choice in each 2-bar chunk that make the part feel organic. We even see the flat 6th, F natural, added in at points to create a fascinating A sus4 flat 6 sound that contrasts the less dissonant sus chord voicings that are used around it. It's a subtle way of creating a sense of harmonic motion without actually having harmonic motion. The amount of reverb used means that each harp note rings out over each other note for quite a long time, which helps this single note line sound more like full chords and fill out the music. But more than that, it means that each passing note and colorful non-chord tone used for melodic embellishment of the harp line rings out as well, becoming part of the implied chord to give the sound of lush, full harmonies rich with upper extensions. You may recall this exact same type of harp accompaniment used in our first example, the cursed Shinshu field theme. Another important point is the super high string part that works its way slowly down from the 5th to the root over the course of the entire 8-bar phrase. This addition creates 3 separate rhythmic layers that work together to create the piece's texture. The 8th note based harp accompaniment on the bottom, the quarter note based melody above it, and the string line up top that holds out notes for about 2 bars each. This piece is just dripping with atmosphere, and you can feel it right from the very first notes. This exact same kind of texture is used for the music that introduces the game's curiously French flautist Waka. The piece starts off with this beautiful harp figure, a line that starts on the tonic E and leaps up 2/5 to get to the 9th of the key, F sharp, before jumping back down to a B. From here, we begin a pattern that takes this pair of notes a 5th apart and then moves that intervallic relationship down through an E Dorian scale until we land back at our tonic E. This same 2-bar pattern is then moved to start on a B and varied just enough to clearly evoke a B minor chord, giving us a repeated E minor to B minor progression expressed in just about the most colorful, mystical way possible. Once again, a high string pad holds long notes over top to fill out the texture, but the sound of the harp moving through the scale in such an interesting intervallic pattern absolutely steals the show. Building this pattern off the E Dorian scale, with the raised 6 C sharp used instead of C natural, creates a lighter, more mysterious vibe that we can directly compare to our previous example, Lake Harami. Lake Harami's melody uses the exact same intervallic pattern, taking a pair of notes a 5th apart and moving that idea down through a scale. It even starts on the 9th of the key, just like Enter Waka does. But Lake Harami's melody uses the A natural minor scale as its basis rather than the Dorian scale, and you can hear the difference between the lake's somber calmness and the more curious sounding Waka theme. Unlike the Lake Harami theme though, this melodic line isn't actually the melody of the piece. Like the cursed Shinshu field theme, Enter Waka's melody is played on the shinobue, fitting for a character who plays that instrument in the game, with all the grace notes that you would expect to help establish that idiomatic sound. As the flute melody comes in with Waka's theme, the harp continues to imply the harmony with similar figures to what we heard in the introduction, although now we get to hear it move through a more elaborate, functional chord progression. Again, the harp takes a much more melodic approach to accompaniment, instead of sticking to one repeated pattern, and again the way the notes ring out around each other creates a sense of fuller harmony than there actually is. As we move through each chord, the harp line tends to avoid the thirds of the chords in favor of 4ths and 6ths and 7ths to create a rich harmonic world that supports the melody. There's a clear pattern here. Each of these tunes relies on the harp to establish a beautiful texture. They each balance out a typical Western approach to harmony with their root motion, with unorthodox chord voicings fleshing out the harmony, all supporting beautiful melodies that manage to tap into and evoke a traditional Japanese style while still speaking to a Western sensibility. This game is a true work of art. I love everything about it, and I'm frankly shocked it took me this long to make a video on it. Hope you enjoyed the video, and big thanks to patron Jason Uloa for requesting this game. If you'd like to join Mr. Uloa in supporting this channel, you can go to my Patreon page and find full score transcriptions of each of the tunes I talked about here for $5 and up patrons. Thank you so much for watching, and now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play Okami again.